decisions. And it would have also been related, of course, to the recognition of the IRA as a military organization or as a criminal organization, and those kind of discussions. I imagine they were all entwined in those, but just without this language that we're using today. Mm-hmm. So yeah, it would be fascinating to go back and really explore.
Yeah, I just do a quick follow-up. I mean, presumably this wasn't, this transformation over time was not simply a capricious thing, that there'd be some factors that would enter into it. Changing notions of necessity, perhaps. The quite dramatically different nature of threats, which would be related to views of necessity. I mean, I don't think you're suggesting that there's some sort of sudden plummeting in moral norms, but that there's so things become permissible that at one point were really unacceptable on moral grounds, but that there are some real changes in the world that are being taken account of here. Now, whether they're being taken account of in the way you think is defensible or not is another thing, but that there have been some dramatic transformations that both the UK and the US have responded to. And one specific question I had for you, and for anyone on the panel, was the increased use of drones by the Obama administration, which has, as you know, escalated dramatically to specifically target Al-Qaeda and Taliban militants in Pakistan primarily. On what grounds do you think this would be justified? On what grounds should it be, in your view, opposed?
I quite deliberately didn't even mention drones. I've written on that subject as well.
Because that does raise some very specific
It certainly does, but if drones are used for targeting, a sniper rifle could be used for targeting.
Sure.
So I didn't want to get into platforms or methods particularly. But yes, I think the increasing use of drones raises a whole host of issues. As BJ Scores was as BJ's written, that the use of drones has got enormous ethical implications on the sense that we might have a moral obligation to increase this type of unmanned system. It doesn't put our own competence at risk, which has surely got to be a good thing. There might be a moral imperative to reduce risks. There is a moral imperative to reduce risks to our own forces, as long as you can achieve the same effect without that risk requirement. Where BJ and I disagree is that I actually think that on the one level, on that tactical and operational level, you have the imperative to remove people as much as possible from harm's way. At the same time, by doing that, you're actually at the strategic level making success increasingly remote. So there's a counter. The methods that we choose are actually making success less likely in the long run. So there's competing moral problems here, I'd suggest. But it's a huge subject. There's not more to it than just that.
Sir.
Disclaimer, I'm Irish. And so when you said that the IRA were terrorists that bothered them, I was just wondering if there isn't some fertile ground for the august body here in the workshop or whatever to examine your statements and the legitimacy of your position from the perspective of an Irishman. In my opinion, and if you read Leon Uris' Trinity, for instance, England invaded Ireland. Was that legitimate or not? Was what they did to the people in Ireland proportional, given that they might be non-combatants, if you want to phrase it that way? What I read is that there was more of an emphasis on taking land so they could graze cattle on it than feeding the Irish people, and they died in the millions. Do you look at the division of Ireland as a legitimate thing to have happened? what is the role of the British in Northern Ireland? Is an IRA operative, and I have a problem saying someone is in the Army, IRA, and a terrorist in the same sentence. Either one or the other, I think. But, you know, there must be some, I almost got to the point where I was saying, was the North in the United States legitimate in forcing their way into the South in our Civil War to cause the Union to occur? If you take that perspective and then look at the desire on the part of the Irish Republic to reunite, is there a corollary there? You see, I'm getting a little emotional about it, getting a little bit out of sync.
It sounds like an entire conference right there.
It does.
Well, let's let David answer very quickly because we're running.
From the University of Dublin on the panel.
Sure. That's my job.
Ed's asked me to be brief. I'm not sure going back to the Middle Ages is necessarily particularly helpful. How long you can hold a just cause for is a huge question, and certainly not one I'm going to try and attempt to answer here. Obviously, the self-determination of the Northern Irish political community is a huge issue here as well. I think that it was interesting that after 9/11, it was remarkable how quickly the IRA did seem to suddenly become a terrorist organization as far as many Americans were concerned, because they targeted innocent civilians. So therefore, they suddenly, rather than supporting them, the IRA, funnily enough, suddenly realized that it might have to change the way it did business. So that was a sea change for our political landscape as well, in many ways. Although, also, you have to bear in mind that the 20th century of Anglican, it's starting to get long, isn't it? Is the history of the IRA becoming recognized, becoming acceptant of the political process, going into politics, and then fighting against other bits of the old IRA that decided not to embrace that. And you see this happen generation after generation, from the Second World War, where the Irish Prime Minister, a former IRA man, is acting with the British to suppress other still active IRA. It's a rather complex area.
Michael, did you have a
I was
comment?
just going to add one word to that. I'm surprised that the issue is so contentious still. I'm used to hearing all about Palestinians, so it's interesting to see that the Irish and the English are still going at it. But of course, this is a problem that has not left us. One point you have to keep in mind is that historically, and I'm not necessarily going back to the Middle Ages, but at least back 40 or 50 years, that most of the anti-colonial liberation, anti-occupation movements employed terrorism. They weren't necessarily all terrorist organizations the way we define them today, like Al-Qaeda. But it's hard to think of any anti-colonial national liberation group that didn't use some form of terrorism, however you want to define it. And also that these groups change over time. Their evaluation and their acceptance changes over time. So the PLO was once regarded as a terrorist organization, later became more mainstream. Hezbollah, its military wing is sometimes considered a terrorist, its political wing is not. And that's also moving in the direction of becoming more acceptable. The Taliban were recently taken off the list of unlawful combatants by the United States, because, for political reasons, and because some of them are also changing their tactics a little bit. They engage more in conventional type fighting rather than only terrorism, but they usually don't give up their terrorism entirely until their grievances have been resolved. So it's not so much freedom fighter or terrorist, it's freedom fighter and terrorist. Very often they go together. And that raises all the problems that we were discussing here. Questions about giving them their rights, reading their rights, arresting them first, not arresting them first. Should they be treated under the laws of law enforcement or not the laws of law enforcement? Is targeted killing an acceptable act of war? Is it assassination? Is it execution? That's the muddy line that we're all trying to navigate here. There are no clear answers. A lot of passion, though, so that's good.
And I must tell you that a distant uncle of mine is Blackjack Kehoe, who started the Molly Maguires in the eastern coal regions of Pennsylvania, and is a terrorist, was a terrorist, was hung by the neck until dead for that in his fight against the mine owners.
We have
Good book if you ever have it.
2 minutes, and I think, let's see, question in the back, sir?
A question for Professor Gross. The question itself, and I'll try to pose this very quickly, could be very offensive to all serving military because it seems to presume a lack of professionalism. I don't intend it that way. Given the change in the anthropology of conflict, the fact that we're going into more and more of these asymmetric situations, in nations that have an all-volunteer military, do you see any relationship between the fact that these are in some ways more hazardous, morally hazardous, and difficult situations to engage in conflict, and the increased risk that is necessarily being undertaken by the military in these situations? Is there any equation in your mind between what is expected, or maybe expected of those kinds of military personnel in all voluntary situations and the risks they may be asked to undertake versus services that are conscripted?
So the outcome would be that volunteers knowingly take on risks, so they may be placed in riskier situations?
Right.
Knowing that the nature of conflict today is changing and is creating these much more morally hazardous situations where we have non-combatants that are difficult to dissociate their immunity from combatants. Where you have an all-volunteer military, knowing they're volunteering to go into that kind of a circumstance, is the level of risk they may be expected to undertake greater than it perhaps was historically when we had more classical Westphalian type of combat and conscripted services? And if the answer to that question is yes, and I'm not presuming it is, how do we teach people to lead in that situation?
I'm not sure off the top of my head that it necessarily would be greater. As I said, that the acceptable level of risk for soldiers, whether it's a conscripted army or a volunteer army, I think is a professional consideration. I mean, there's going to be certain on-the-field decisions that are going to be made relative to conserving your force, and on one hand, to obtaining and achieving a military advantage, on the other, balancing your losses against your gains, that is going to remain unaffected whether you're dealing with conscripts or not. But I suppose if you had the only case I could think of off the top of my head was if you had an elite group that volunteered for extra dangerous missions and took it upon themselves to do that. But I don't really see that much difference. A lot is made of the difference between a conscript army and a professional army. Do you have to remember in Israel, a country with a conscripted army, there's a general consensus that this is what people want to do. And although individuals are conscripted, they serve their papers and they're forced to go into the army, there's a general social acceptance that this is what we want to do as a country. We all agree that we're going to conscript people when they're 18 years old, send them to the army for 3 years. So it's not that it's done without the blessings of society or against any form of social contract. There's a contract to do that. So again, off the top of my head, professionally, I don't think there would be any difference to the risk that you would impose on soldiers in either of the two armies. Although in each army you would have special instances where volunteers may willingly assume greater risk than the level of risk that you would normally assign to soldiers in the course of their responsibilities.
George?
Well, I think that question goes to the heart of a problem that many of us who have been part of this conference over the years and are engaged in military education are deeply concerned with. In that, if you want to use your image, Michael, of indeterminacy at the bottom of all of these intuitions or all of these sort of conceptions that we use to talk about law of war and conduct of hostilities and so forth, perhaps the greatest one is what the position is for which a conscript is conscripted or a volunteer is volunteering. It's an issue in the sense of informed consent. To what am I giving my consent when I decide to volunteer for the armed forces? There is not a community of professional reflection about what that responsibility entails. It's one of the greatest dilemmas we face right now. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff called a national meeting of military educators to reflect on the fact that we don't really have a good sense of what military professionalism is. He couched that in a number of ways, that in our case, in the American situation, that the American people don't know who their military are anymore. And that's one piece of civil-military relations. But the deeper question that the Army, for example, is reflecting on in its project on the Army professional ethic is that an Army officer takes